Hello, my name is Ian, and in this first video we're just going to get started by creating the different layers that we'll be using to build the colour map. So I'm going to start by coming into the project files, into the project files folder, and opening up this Pegasus landscape colour map start file. So in here we already have a landscape. This landscape is the same landscape that was used, that was created in the landscape creation video series on the sideeffects.com/Pegasus website. So if you want to know how this landscape was created, do go and watch those videos, and I talk through the process of creating this landscape. But if you come inside this landscape geometry node, I also have the complete landscape network still here for you to look at. So as I said, I explained this entire process in that video series, but I've also added a few notes and annotations just so you can have an idea of what the kind of process was for creating this landscape. And I've cached the landscape out, so you haven't got to worry about having to cook the landscape to work with it. So this is the starting point that I'll be using to create the colour map. I'm just going to check that so it's not visible and set my colour map to be visible. Now if we come inside, this in here is where we're going to be building out our network to create the colour map. I just have an object merge, which is merging in the output from this landscape geometry node. So it's merging in from the end here. I'm going to just quickly add a HeightField visualize here, just so we can visualize some of the information that we already have on the landscape. So let's add this water, and let's also add the debris as well. So, as usual, when you run the HeightField road nodes, you get a buildup of debris and water appearing on the landscape. And all that information is still here on this HeightField. You can find middle mouse click on this node, we can see these different layers that already exist. So we have height, mask, bedrock, debris, sediment, and water. I'll be using a few different of these layers to create the colour map, but I want to add some additional masks to build up the colour map. I want to have some different colours for maybe the cliffs, some rock debris that appears at the bottom of the cliffs where they've been eroding. We want to add some sand area for this area, which is kind of like the sea around the outside of the island. And then I probably also want to use this debris and water layers to add some additional detail as well. So let's start doing that. Now that I can visualize this information here, I can see what's there. I no longer need this HeightField visualize, so I'm just going to delete that. And I'm going to start building up these layers. And we are imagining these as layers, so these build up on one top of the other. So the first layer I'm going to create is kind of a base layer. Now I'm just going to flood fill this entire HeightField with a mask, and that'll be the base layer, and then we can layer additional layers on top of that. So to create that base layer, I'm just going to drag off from this object merge and add down a HeightField wrangle. And I can find that just by typing HF for HeightField and start typing wrangle, and there we have it. So if I drop this down, I can use this to quickly flood fill this entire HeightField with a mask by simply typing @mask equals 1, and then end that with a semicolon. That will flood fill this entire landscape with a mask. Now, I'm going to be creating lots of different layers, and I'm going to align them in columns along here, one after the other, and then I'm going to merge them together. So what I want to do is create the mask, and then do a little bit of prep before I merge them together. The first thing I'm going to add after this HeightField wrangle is a HeightField remap. And I'm adding a HeightField remap here because it's important that when we export this HeightField from Houdini to Unreal, that we clamp any of our layers so that they are between a value of 0 and 1. So I'm going to come up to Layer 2 Remap and select Mask. And then I'm going to check Clamp to Minimum and Clamp to Maximum. And that's going to clamp to our minimum and maximum values, which here is 0 and 1, and that's what we want. If you have any values above 1 or below 0, negative values, then you'll start to see some weird artifacts appearing inside Houdini, inside Unreal when we apply this to a landscape material. So I'm adding this remap here just to ensure that the values of the layer are between 0 and 1. In this case, I know my HeightField wrangle, here it says my mask is a value of 1. So in this particular case, it's perhaps not necessary, but I find it's always good practice to have it here to ensure that I don't have any problems later on in the process. And what I'll be doing is building these nodes and then copying them and pasting them and reusing them for each of my layers. So this is just to kind of get us started and get this set up. Next, I'm going to add a blast. And when I'm using a blast is I'm going to use it to delete all of the layers apart from the mask layer, so that when I merge them together, I don't end up with multiple layers. And I'll just demonstrate that now, actually. If I was to drop down a merge here, and then drag and drop my object merge, we can see, if I'm on the merge, I have height mask, bedrock, debris, sediment, water, and then another set of height mask, bedrock, debris, sediment. So what I'm going to do is blast all of the unnecessary layers. And I just want to keep the mask layer. So check delete non-selected. Now I have just the mask layer. So I'm not going to have any of those unnecessary layers when I come to merge them together. And then finally, I'm going to add a HeightField copy layer. And with this node, I'm going to take the mask layer, which is now the only layer I have, mask, and I'm going to rename it or move it to a new destination, and I'm going to call this particular layer base. So now I have that mask layer copied as a new layer called base. And actually, rather than having to, because I'm going to keep copying and reusing these nodes, I don't have to keep selecting this node and coming into this parameter and changing it. Instead, I'm going to use an expression, and I'm going to replace the destination from base and replace it with $, capital O, capital S. Now, if I middle mouse click on the destination label here, we can see that's been resolved to HeightField copy layer 1, which is the name of the node. So if I can rename this to base, you can see that destination has been replaced with base. And I'm going to give these nodes a color. I'm just going to hit C to bring up my color palette and color them red. This way they're easily visible. I can easily find them, select them, and copy and paste them as I need to reuse them. So I have my first layer set up. I've created a mask. I've ensured that the values are between 0 and 1. I've blasted all but the mask layer, so deleting all the layers that I no longer need, and then renaming it to base. And I'm going to continue this process to build up my different layers. So the next layer that I want to create is I want to have a different kind of grass depending on whether I'm in the highland areas or in the lower lying areas. So I want to create a mask for the lowland. And I can do that using a HeightField mask by feature. So let's add a HeightField mask by feature. And I don't want to mask by slope, so I'm going to uncheck that. I want to mask instead by height. So I'm going to hit compute range to get the full range of the height. Come over to this cog and switch this to linear. And let's bring this point down and bring this point up, so invert it. And then I just want to create a mask that is somewhere in the middle. Something like that. So now I've got a mask which only applies to the low areas. And remember I said we're going to be building up different layers on top of this. So another layer for the sand, another layer for the cliffs. So it's important that I have this layer kind of towards the bottom of the layer stack. Now, this layer's okay, but it's a bit uninteresting. It's quite a very linear line running across the entire of the landscape, so that might look a little dull, a little uninteresting. And we'll also have this very soft blend between two tiling textures, so that might look a little odd. So what I'm going to do is add, after this HeightField mask by feature, a HeightField slump. Now if we take a look at this, what this layer does is it takes the input mask and slumps it down the landscape. So if I reduce these spread iterations, we can see it kind of slowly slumping back up the landscape until it's back as it was. So I can use this to add some extra kind of more interesting detail to this mask. So we have spread iterations, which is the number of iterations the kind of debris slumps down the landscape. We also have here a height factor, and this height factor adjusts how much influence the height has on the kind of slump simulation. So this is kind of interesting. Something else we can do is if after the HeightField mask by feature and before the HeightField slump, I'm going to add a HeightField wrangle. And in here, I'm going to type @mask asterisk for multiplication equals, and I want to create a parameter to multiply the mask layer by. So I'm going to type CHF to create a float parameter, so a float channel, and then open brackets. I'm going to type the name of that parameter, which I'm going to call multiply. So I'm going to add in a quotation mark and then type multiply, end quotation mark, end brackets, and then end with a semicolon. And that's going to go blank, and that's because we haven't created the parameter yet. So I'm going to come over to this button over here. If I click that now, we now have a parameter called multiply. As I increase this, we can see that mask fade back in. And if I increase this above a value of 1, I'm actually multiplying and increasing the intensity of this mask. So let's see what effect that has on the HeightField slump. So as I increase this multiply, it kind of increases the sharpness of the HeightField slump. So the higher the mask value, kind of the more material are adding to the mask to then be slumped down the landscape. And in fact, if we come down here, we're actually adding material to the landscape. So when this is a value of 1, let's just reset these values. So we're adding some debris to the bedrock, and as we increase the multiplier, more and more slump. In this particular case, we aren't actually interested in adding material to the bedrock. We're just interested in adjusting and fine-tuning our slump mask. So I'm going to select the HeightField slump and uncheck Add to Bedrock. I'm also going to uncheck Allowing Material Outflow, and that will ensure that we don't get that border along the edge of the HeightField. So now I'm going to adjust my HeightField slump. So let's bring down that height factor to 0.2. And see if I just want to adjust the spread iterations. So I'm going to leave that at 140 for the spread iterations. So we created a mask here for the lowland areas, and then I create this multiplier just to increase the kind of intensity of that mask, and then use this HeightField slump to slump it down the landscape and just add a bit more visual interest to that mask. And we can always come in and fine tune this if we want to. I'm going to just change this from auto update to mouse up. That'll make it a bit easier to adjust these values. There we go, I think that'll work nicely. And just as I said before, come over and select these red nodes and hold Alt and drag them over here to create a copy, and then connect this HeightField slump to the HeightField remap. So the HeightField remap, as I said before, is ensuring our values are clamped between a value of 0 and 1. But if I hit compute range, we can see that mask has a maximum value of 6, which I don't want. I want to ensure that it's capped at a value of 1. I'm then blasting all of the layers apart from the mask layer and renaming it to, I'm going to want to rename it to base. I want to rename this one to lowlands. So now I have this lowlands mask. Okay. Let's keep this nice and tidy. If you want to keep this nice and tidy, you can select some nodes and hold and click on your keyboard Shift L, and that will line these up. You can also select nodes, and if I hold A and then left mouse click and swipe up, that also stacks these nodes. I can also hold A and left click, swipe right, and that will align them horizontally. And depending on where you put the mouse, you can swipe them up here, or I can swipe them to align with the bottom node. So, a few handy tips to keep your network nice and tidy. Okay, the next mask I want to create is a mask for the sand. So a mask for this kind of seabed area around the edge of the island. And for this, I can simply use another HeightField mask by feature. So I'm going to drop off from the object merge, hit tab and search for HeightField mask by feature. And again, I don't want to mask by slope, I want mask by height. And I'm going to hit this little cog and switch to linear. Again, let's just adjust this. And at the moment we're just putting a value of 0 and 1. I could have compute range, but I'm actually not too bothered about masking these areas up here. So instead, I'm just going to switch the max height to say 5. Or maybe a bit more, 10. And just to adjust this height ramp. There we go. So now we have a mask for the sand area. And so I want maybe to come up a bit higher. I want it to come up part way up the cliffs. So that when I create the cliff layer, that'll be laid over the top and kind of clip over the top of this sand mask. So it's okay for it to kind of ride up the edge of the cliffs a little bit. Okay, that's looking nice. I don't need to do anything else to this mask. So I'm just going to come over to these 3 nodes, copy them, and paste them over here. Let's just line these up a bit more neatly, and plug in the HeightField mask by feature into the HeightField remap. And we're going to rename the HeightField copy layer to sand. So now I have the sand layer. Okay. Next, let's create a mask for the cliffs. So for any of these steep slopes, I want to add a cliff texture to the side of them. So from the mask from the object merge, drag off and search for HeightField mask by feature. And this time I do want to mask by slope. I'm going to come to the slope ramp and just select this furthest point and hit delete and adjust this minimum slope angle. So let's bring it up a little bit. Just remember I've got on mouse up, so I need to let go of the parameter to see the update. Let's set this to 40. A little more cliff than that, so let's reduce this to say 35. Okay, I'm happy with that. So let's do this same again. I'm going to select these 3 nodes, hold Alt, drag them over here, and plug in the HeightField mask by feature. And I want to name this one Cliffs. So now I have my cliff mask. Okay, now that I have this cliff mask, I want to add some debris to the bottom of these cliffs. So where these cliffs are eroding, we're going to have debris building up at the bottom of the cliffs. So from the HeightField mask by feature, I'm going to drag off and add another HeightField slump. And as you can see, that mask has slumped down the HeightField and is now got debris building up. And I can reduce the spread iterations. We can see that debris kind of sliding back up the landscape, back to where it started. So I'm going to set the spread iterations to 140. And I'm going to increase this repose angle. I'll hold over the repose angle and just read the description. The maximum slope measured in degrees from the horizontal at which loose solid material will remain in place without sliding. Well, if I increase this repose angle, let's see what happens. So the debris now is not slumping quite so far down the landscape. It's kind of building up and creating these kind of mounds. And this effect is similar to, if I just bring up Google, just a quick image search, we have these piles of debris. The debris builds up, and at a certain point, it builds up and it builds up until it's so steep that debris will no longer stay and kind of on the pile. It will simply slide down and then start building up at the base. So that's what that repose angle is. It's setting the angle at which debris will build up, and then when it reaches a certain angle, it will no longer be able to maintain its place. It's too steep and the debris will continue to slide off. So that's what this repose angle kind of represents. So I'm going to set this to a repose angle of 25. And that kind of adds these nice piles of debris at the base of our cliffs. And I'm going to leave add to bedrock enabled because I want to actually add this debris to the landscape. And with that, I'm going to select these 3 nodes that we copied earlier on and paste them again. Add the HeightField slump. I want to name these 2 rocks. These are going to be rocks at the bottom of our landscape, at the bottom of our cliffs. Okay. Now, with the last 2 masks, I actually want to just use some of the information we've already got on our HeightField from the erosion simulations. So I'm going to use debris and I'm going to use the water to create some additional masks. So from the object merge, I'm going to click, drag off over here, and this time I'm going to add a HeightField copy layer. So for this layer, I'm going to come to source and set this to debris. And I'm going to set the destination to mask. So now I can see this debris layer visualized in the viewport as a mask. Okay, I can now add a HeightField remap if I want to, and set the layer to remap to mask, and I can just adjust this mask, just sharpen it up a little bit. Just kind of get the look that I want. And if you bring this bottom one up, you can kind of clip out some of these kind of more faint areas. Okay, I'm happy with that. So again, I'm going to copy these 3 nodes. And again, this HeightField remap, using it to clamp the values of the layer between a value of 0 and 1. Again, this is pretty important on this debris layer because if I hit compute range, you can actually see this has values above a value of 1. So this HeightField remap just ensures we're clamping these values between 0 and 1. And I want to rename this to, or back to debris. And I'm actually now going to select all of these nodes here and copy them. And this time, rather than copying the source as debris, I'm going to select water. And now I've kind of visualized this water that's on the landscape as a mask. Again, we can just adjust this mask, maybe make it a little sharper, get a little more detail out of it, and update this HeightField copy layer, update the name to rename it to riverbed. If we zoom out, here are all the different layers that we've created. We can bring these a little closer together just to make them a little neater. And also, hovering over the network view, if I click on my keyboard Shift S, or change that kind of layout of these lines to make them a little more readable. So we now have all of these different layers. So we have a base layer, lowlands, sand, cliffs, rocks, debris, and riverbed. Now, I want to merge all of these together so we have each of these layers kind of combined together. And the reason I create them kind of in parallel here in columns is so that, rather than in a line, kind of one connected to the other, rather than doing it this way, I've done it this way so that if I want to come back and make a change, I don't have to recook any downstream nodes. Instead, I can kind of have them in parallel, make adjustments, and haven't got to recook kind of a very long line of nodes. So working this way is a little bit more efficient. So to merge these together, I'm simply going to use a merge node. And I'm going to select all of these bottom nodes, drag from one of them, and I'll select all of the wires from each, and I'm going to add a merge. And now if I middle click on this merge node, we can see we have all of our layers merged together. So I have base, lowlands, sand, cliffs, rocks. So I have all of them here on one node. You might notice I do have multiple masks though, which I don't want. So after this merge, I'm just going to add a blast. And then from the group, I'm going to select mask. And now if I middle mouse click, we can see I have just the layers that I created. But you'll also notice I've got no height. So I actually have no height information now on my landscape. And what I actually want to do is I want to keep the HeightField information from this HeightField slump that I used to create the rocks layer. Because you remember, when I visualize this HeightField slump, this node is actually adding some additional information to the landscape. It's adding in to the bedrock this slump material, and I want to keep that information. So what I'm going to do is come to the blast node for this particular layer and come up to group. Let's visualize it first. Come up to group and select height. So now this particular blast node is blasting all of the layers apart from mask and height. So now when I visualize our merged layers, I have the height information retained along with that slump. And just to demonstrate that we still have all of these layers present, I'm going to add down a HeightField visualize and start adding in some of our layers. So I'm going to start with a riverbed here. So we've got the riverbeds, we've got debris, and then rocks, cliffs. We've got the sand for the area around the island, and then we've also got lowlands. So we have a mask here that's for the low-lying areas, and then finally we have the base layer that's underneath everything. So we have all of these layers present now on one HeightField. And in the next video, I'm going to start to create a digital asset that can use these layers to begin building a color map.